Here is what a senior American Special Operations commander wrote in a classified internal memo at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday night in the spring of 2006. He did not write it for the press. He did not write it for the politicians. He wrote it for his superiors at Joint Special Operations Command, Balad Air Base, Iraq. It was meant to be a candid, eyes-only assessment of a coalition partner element before a proposed joint compound assault in North Baghdad. The relevant passage, when later recounted to defense journalists during background research interviews, read approximately as follows. Shadow element assessed as under strength for assigned objective. Advise supplementing with additional U.S. fire team. Footwear noted as non-standard. Operational readiness uncertain. Intelligence officer attached is non-combat personnel. Female. Advise reassignment before execution. That memo was written at 11:14 p.m. By 12:03 a.m., the compound had been cleared. The shadow element took no casualties. 4 high-value targets were detained. The American Supplemental Fire Team had not been deployed. The female intelligence officer had not been reassigned. And somewhere in a duty room in Balad, a general read the after-action report and said 5 words to his intelligence officer. Those lunatics wore sandals. The answer to that statement, and it is a statement that contains a question inside it. The way a bullet contains a firing pin is a story that the Pentagon spent years trying to comprehend. It is a story about a unit so small it barely registered in the American order of battle. A unit that operated in sandals and civilian trousers, while the most expensive military apparatus in human history watched from drone feeds overhead. A unit that over 18 months of peak operational tempo in the most dangerous city on Earth quietly removed 3,500 terrorists from the battlefield. Not captured, not negotiated with, not monitored from a safe distance. Removed. But this is not the story of the men who went through the door. Not primarily. This is the story of the woman who told them which door to go through. Her name was Megan Calloway. And before we get to the compound, before we get to Baghdad, before we get to the Sandals, you need to understand where she came from and what she was carrying long before she ever carried a classified file into a war zone. Stay with me. There is a valley in western Montana where the Bitterroot River runs south to north through cottonwood flats and hay meadows that turn gold in September and white in November and stay white until April. The mountains on either side are not famous mountains. They are not the Rockies that appear on postcards. They are the kind of mountains that people who actually live among mountains take seriously. Steep, forested, full of weather that changes faster than a man can prepare for it. Megan Calloway grew up in a house at the edge of one of those meadows, 4 miles outside of town, with 1 gas station, 1 diner, and a post office that doubled as a polling place every November. Her mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. Her father, Staff Sergeant Emmett Calloway, had served in the First Gulf War in 1991 with the 3rd Armored Division. He had been part of the left hook through the Iraqi desert, the 100-hour ground campaign that the newspapers called a triumph, and that the men who fought it called something else when they were alone with each other. Emmett came home in the spring of '91. He came home with all his limbs. He came home with a Bronze Star and a Combat Infantryman badge and a certificate of appreciation signed by a general whose name he could never remember. He came home to a wife who loved him, and a valley that had not changed, and a daughter who was not yet born, but who would arrive 14 months later, and who would, for the first 6 years of her life, believe that her father was the most extraordinary man who had ever lived. He was the man who taught her to read a topographic map before she could read a chapter book, who took her into the Bitterroots on weekends with a compass and a paper map and no GPS, and taught her to find her way back by reading the land itself, the direction of the drainage, the angle of the shadows, the way snow accumulates differently on north-facing slopes. He taught her that information was not something you received. It was something you extracted from the world by paying attention to things that other people walked past without noticing. He told her once, sitting on a ridge above the valley, with the whole Bitterroot spread out below them, that the most important thing he had learned in the desert was not how to fight. The fight is the last thing, Meggie. The fight is what happens when everything else has already been decided. The side that wins is the side that understood the ground first, understood the enemy first, understood the pattern first. The bullets are just the punctuation at the end of the sentence. The sentence was written days before anyone pulled a trigger. She was 8 years old when he told her that. She did not understand it then. She would understand it completely by the time she was 26, standing in an operations room in Baghdad, drawing lines on a map that connected human beings to their deaths. But between 8 and 26, something happened that changed the shape of everything. Emmett Calloway did not die in the Bitterroot Valley all at once. He died the way a river undercuts a bank, slowly, invisibly. Until the day the ground simply collapses and everyone standing nearby acts surprised, even though the signs had been there for years. The drinking started before Megan could identify it as drinking. It was just what Dad did in the evening. Then it was what Dad did in the afternoon. Then it was what Dad did instead of going to the diner or fixing the fence or attending the school play, where Megan had 3 lines as a narrator and had practiced them in the mirror for 2 weeks. The nightmares she heard through the wall of her bedroom. The morning she came downstairs to find him asleep on the sofa with the television still on and a look on his face that was not sleep. It was something else. Something that looked like sleep the way a frozen lake looks like solid ground. Her mother used the phrase bad days the way other mothers use the phrase busy at work. A euphemism wrapped in another euphemism, wrapped in the silence that military families learn to maintain because the alternative is a conversation that nobody has been trained to have. Emmett Calloway died on a Saturday afternoon in October when Megan was 16 years old. He was sitting on the sofa in the living room. There was a bottle on the floor beside him. The television was on. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to chronic alcohol-related cardiomyopathy. The actual cause of death was a war that had ended 15 years earlier and had never stopped being fought inside the man who came home from it. There was no funeral with military honors. Emmett had let his VA enrollment lapse years before. There was a service at the church in town attended by people who remembered the man he had been before the desert and did not know what to say about the man he had become after it. Megan sat in the front pew and did not cry. Not because she was strong, because something had locked inside her that day, some mechanism that she would not be able to name for another 10 years. And the locked thing said very clearly and very quietly that crying was not going to answer the question. And the question was this: what killed him? Not the alcohol, not the heart. Those were mechanisms. What killed him was something that had followed him home from the desert. Something that had no name in the vocabulary available to a 16-year-old girl in western Montana. Something that the Veterans Administration had failed to treat because it had failed to diagnose, because it had failed to ask, because in 1992, nobody was asking the questions that needed to be asked about the men who came back from a war that everyone had already decided was a clean victory. Megan Calloway enlisted in the United States Army 5 days after her 18th birthday. Her mother did not argue. Her mother understood in the way that women who have been married to soldiers understand that the decision had been made long before the paperwork was signed. Probably on that Saturday in October. Probably while sitting in the front pew. Probably in the exact moment when the locked thing inside her had said crying is not going to answer the question. She did not enlist to fight. She enlisted to understand. Specifically, she enlisted to understand how information moved through hostile networks, how patterns formed and dissolved and reformed, how a seemingly disconnected series of events, a phone call here, a money transfer there, a vehicle moving along a particular road at a particular hour, could be assembled into a picture of intent. Because her father had taught her on those ridges in the Bitterroots that understanding the pattern was everything, that the bullets were just punctuation. And she had decided somewhere deep and nonverbal that if she could learn to read the patterns, she could understand the machine that had destroyed her father. Not the war itself, the invisible architecture behind the war. The thing that chose which men it consumed and which it released. She was not looking for revenge. She was looking for the blueprint. Military Intelligence School at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Then the Defense Intelligence Agency Analytical Pipeline. Then a specialized course in network analysis that at the time had fewer than 40 graduates in the entire Department of Defense. The coursework was not glamorous. It was mathematics and sociology and graph theory, and the patient-obsessive work of connecting data points that resisted connection. Phone records, financial transfers, movement patterns, relationship matrices. Megan excelled in a way that made her instructors uncomfortable. Not because a woman was excelling. By 2004, women in military intelligence were neither novel nor remarkable. What made them uncomfortable was the quality of her perception. She did not analyze networks the way the textbooks taught. She did not start from the known nodes and work outward. She started from the gaps, from the absences, from the places in the data where a connection should exist but did not. And she asked the question that most analysts never thought to ask. Why is this space empty? Her thesis project at the DIA identified a previously undetected logistics node in an East African militant network by analyzing not the communications that existed, but the communications that were missing. A cluster of operatives who should have been in contact with each other based on their geographic proximity and operational function were not communicating through any intercepted channel. The absence of communication was itself the signal. It meant they were communicating through a channel that had not yet been identified. That channel, when subsequently located by signals intelligence assets, led to the disruption of a planned attack on a Western embassy. She was 24 years old. She had never held a weapon in an operational environment. She had never been inside an armored vehicle that was not parked in a motor pool. And she had just prevented an embassy bombing by noticing a silence. Colonel Raymond Hale found her file in January of 2006 during a personnel review that he was conducting for reasons that no one outside a very small circle at Fort Bragg was permitted to know. Hale was 50 years old, silver-haired, deliberate in his movements, a man who had spent 30 years in special operations and had arrived at the conclusion that the most dangerous weapon in any theater was not a rifle or a drone or a 500-pound bomb. It was a mind that could see what the enemy believed was invisible. He was building something. He had been given authorization by Major General Arthur Drummond, the JSOC commander, to assemble what Drummond called an industrial counterterrorism capability for the Baghdad operational area. Not individual raids, not high-value target hunting as a discrete activity, a continuous cycle. Find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze. Running every single night. Simultaneously across multiple districts. Intelligence from each operation feeding directly into planning for the next operation within hours of the previous one concluding. The Americans had the technology, the drone fleets, the NSA intercept capability, the signals intelligence that could triangulate a mobile phone to within 30 meters of its last transmission, the surveillance platforms that could hold a fixed-wing loop over a Baghdad neighborhood for 18 continuous hours. What they did not have enough of was what Shadow Cell provided. Human capability at the point of contact. The operators who could move through a Baghdad alleyway at 2 in the morning without looking like soldiers. Who could wear local clothing, sandals, civilian trousers, not because they were ordered to, but because blend was a tactical tool, and tactical tools existed to be used. Who could clear a 2-story compound in darkness, take 4 prisoners without a single discharge extract with the intelligence materials that the next night's operation depended on, and be back in the operations room before sunrise? But the operators were the hands. Hale needed a brain, a specific kind of brain, a brain that could take the raw material flowing in from every raid, every phone intercept, every detainee interview, every captured document, and synthesize it in real time into a continuously updating map of the enemy network. Not a static picture. A living, breathing model that showed not just where the enemy was, but where the enemy was about to be. He found 3 candidates. He chose Megan Calloway. He chose her because of the embassy analysis. He chose her because her network reconstruction methodology was in its professional assessment 5 years ahead of anything the intelligence community was producing. But he also chose her for a reason he did not write in the selection memo. He chose her because he had read her personal file. He had seen the father's service record, the Gulf War deployment, the Bronze Star, the medical discharge, the death certificate. And he recognized something in the trajectory of her career that was more than ambition and more than talent. It was purpose. The particular kind of purpose that only arrives after loss. Megan Calloway landed in Baghdad on a military transport in early February of 2006. The air smelled like diesel fuel and burning trash, and something else underneath both of those things that she would later learn was the smell of a city that had been afraid for so long that the fear had become architectural. It was in the concrete, in the dust, in the way the buildings leaned slightly toward each other as if bracing for the next explosion. She was driven to the compound that the shadow cell operators called the Fishbowl, a requisitioned mansion in the Green Zone that served as operations-based living quarters and intelligence center. The mansion had marble floors and a swimming pool that no one used, and a chandelier in the entrance hall that still worked, and that someone had decorated with spent brass casings as a joke that had stopped being funny months ago. She was met by Sergeant First Class Nolan Pruitt. Pruitt was 38 years old and looked 50. 4 operational rotations in Iraq and Afghanistan had carved lines into his face that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the specific kind of erosion that comes from spending too many nights making decisions that determine whether other people continue to exist. He was lean in the way that operational soldiers are lean, not gym lean but work lean, the leanness of a man whose body has been pared down to exactly what is required and nothing more. His hands were scarred. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter. And when he looked at Megan Calloway, standing in the entrance hall of the Fishbowl, with her rucksack and her laptop case and her intelligence officer credentials, what he saw was a problem. He did not see a woman. That distinction is important. Pruitt had served with female intelligence officers before. He had no philosophical objection to their presence. What he saw was a non-combat analyst being attached to a direct action unit that conducted kinetic operations every single night in the most lethal urban environment on Earth. And he saw a person who would need to be protected, and protection required resources, and resources were the one thing Shadow Cell did not have to spare. He said this to Colonel Hale directly, in the operations room, with Megan standing 6 feet away, close enough to hear every word. "Colonel, I have 60 operators. I lose one, I feel it for a month. I cannot afford to assign a security detail to someone who is not going through doors. I am not questioning her qualifications. I am questioning the math." Hale looked at Pruitt. Then he looked at Megan. Then he looked back at Pruitt and said 4 words. "Give her a week." Pruitt did not respond. He looked at Megan one more time, the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he has been told to integrate into a system that is already running at capacity, and he walked out of the room. Megan did not say anything. She did not argue. She did not make a case for herself. She had learned from her father, though she would not have described it this way, that the only argument that matters is the one you make with results. Words are negotiable. Results are not. She set up her workstation in a corner of the operations room. 3 monitors, a classified network terminal, a whiteboard that she requested from the logistics officer, who looked at her as though she had asked for a grand piano. She unpacked her laptop. She opened the intelligence files that had been compiled over the previous 3 months of Shadow Cell operations in Baghdad. Target packages, network diagrams, phone intercept logs, detainee interview summaries, aerial surveillance imagery, and she began to work. For 6 hours, she did not speak. She did not eat. She did not look up from the screens and the whiteboard. Operators walked through the operations room on their way to and from briefings and saw the new intelligence officer sitting in her corner drawing lines on a whiteboard, and most of them did not think about her at all. At the end of 6 hours, she stood up, walked to the main intelligence display board, where the existing network diagram of Al-Qaeda operations in North Baghdad was posted, and she began to make changes. Not small changes. Structural changes. She redrew 11 connection points in the network architecture. She identified 4 nodes that had been classified as independent cells and reclassified them as sub-elements of a single coordinating structure. She circled a name that appeared in 3 separate detainee interviews as a peripheral figure and drew a line from that name to the center of the network. She then turned to the operations duty officer, a captain named Winslow, and said the first substantive word she had spoken since arriving in Baghdad. Your network map has the hierarchy inverted. The man you have listed as a local media coordinator is not coordinating media. He is coordinating logistics for vehicle-borne explosive devices across 3 districts. These 4 cells are not independent. They share a supply chain that runs through a single warehouse in the Dora district. And this man here, the one who appears in the margins of 3 interviews and has been assessed as low priority, is the node that connects the supply chain to the bomb-making network. He is not peripheral. He is the architecture. Winslow looked at the board. He looked at her. He looked at the board again. How long have you been here? 6 hours. That evening, Prewitt sat in the briefing room and listened to Megan present her revised network analysis to the assault team leaders who would be conducting that night's operations. She spoke for 11 minutes. She used no slides. She used the whiteboard. She drew the network from memory. Every node, every connection, every assessed vulnerability. When she finished, the room was quiet, in the way that rooms become quiet when the people in them are recalculating something they thought they already understood. Prewitt said nothing during the briefing. He said nothing after it. But later that night before the teams deployed, he walked past her workstation and stopped. He did not look at her. He looked at the whiteboard. The targets you identified for tonight. How confident are you? She looked up at him. Confident enough that if I am wrong, I will be on the first transport out of here tomorrow, and you will never have to think about me again. He looked at her then. Not at the whiteboard, at her. And what he saw was not confidence in the way that briefing officers project confidence, the rehearsed certainty of people presenting conclusions they need others to accept. What he saw was something older and harder and more familiar than that. He saw the look of a person who has staked something real on being right. Who has no safety net, who knows exactly what the consequences of being wrong will be, and has decided to proceed anyway. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the mirror years ago, before his first operational deployment. The look of someone who has decided. He gave her one nod. Then he walked out to brief his team. At 11:14 p.m. that night, Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Bryce, a Delta Force officer operating out of the American Special Operations Compound 3 kilometers from the Fishbowl, filed his classified internal memo. Shadow element assessed as under strength, non-standard footwear. Operational readiness uncertain. Intelligence officer non-combat. Female. Advisory assignment. At 11:19 p.m., Shadow Cell departed the Fishbowl in 3 unmarked vehicles. Sandals, civilian clothing, weapons concealed. The target was a residential compound in the Mansour district that Megan had identified 6 hours earlier as the logistics hub connecting 3 previously unlinked vehicle-borne explosive device cells. At 11:41 p.m., the first team was in position. At 11:44, the door came down. By 12:03 a.m., the compound was clear. 4 high-value targets detained. 0 friendly casualties. The intelligence materials seized from the compound hard drives, phone records, a handwritten ledger of payments to bomb-making cells across 3 districts, were on Megan's desk by 12:30. The American Supplemental Fire Team recommended by Bryce had not been deployed. The female intelligence officer he had recommended for reassignment had been the one who selected the target, identified the entry point, predicted the number of occupants, and assessed the probability of armed resistance. She had been right on every count. And in a duty room in Ballard, a general read the after-action report, looked at the timeline, looked at the casualty figures, looked at the note about non-standard footwear, and said 5 words to his intelligence officer. Those lunatics wore sandals, but the raid itself was not the revelation. Raids were conducted every night in Baghdad. Successful raids were not unusual. What was unusual was what Megan found in the materials that came back from the compound. She worked through the night. The operators slept. The operations room grew quiet. The only sound was the hum of the classified network servers and the scratch of her pen on the whiteboard as she built a new section of the network map from the seized documents. At 4:17 a.m., she stopped writing. On the whiteboard in the center of a web of connections that radiated outward to every active al-Qaeda cell in the Baghdad metropolitan area, she had written a single name: Khalil. Not a commander, not a strategist, not a figurehead whose face appeared on intelligence briefing slides. Khalil was something more dangerous than any of those things. He was a connector, a node through whom information, personnel, and explosive materials flowed between cells that otherwise had no direct contact with each other. He was the architecture of the network made human. Find Khalil and you did not catch one man. You found the blueprint of the entire machine. She presented her findings to Major General Drummond at the morning intelligence briefing. She laid out the connection map. She showed how Khalil appeared as a ghost reference in 14 separate intelligence reports over the previous 8 months, never as a primary subject, always in the margins. A name mentioned by a detainee in passing, a phone number that appeared once in a call log and never again. A reference in a seized document to a facilitator whose physical description matched no one in the existing target database. Drummond listened. He looked at the map. He looked at the 14 data points she had assembled. And then he said something that Megan had expected, but that still landed like a stone dropped into still water. Captain Calloway, we hunt leaders. We do not hunt mailmen. Find me the man at the top of this network. The connectors are someone else's problem. She did not argue. She did not push back. She had learned something about institutional power during her years in military intelligence, something that her father had never taught her because he had never operated at that level. She had learned that the most effective response to being told no by a superior officer was not to argue. It was to be right, and then to wait for the moment when being right became impossible to ignore. She returned to her workstation. She opened a new file on her classified terminal. She labeled it with a project name that did not appear in any official tasking order. Khalil. And she began to build. The file grew in the dark. That is the only way to describe what Megan Calloway built over the next 7 weeks in her corner of the operations room at the Fishbowl. While Shadow Cell conducted its nightly raids according to the official target packages approved by Major General Drummond and his staff, while the operators went through doors and detained suspects and seized materials and came back before sunrise, smelling like cordite and sweat and the particular metallic tang of adrenaline leaving the human body. Megan was running a parallel investigation that existed on no tasking order and had been authorized by no one. Every night, the operators brought back material, hard drives, SIM cards, handwritten notes in Arabic that the translators processed by morning, phone logs, financial records scratched in ballpoint pen on the backs of receipts, and every morning Megan took that material and fed it into 2 separate analytical streams. The first was the official stream, the network map that Drummond had ordered the hunt for leadership targets, the men at the top. She did that work well. She did it fast. No one could question her performance on the tasked mission. The second stream was Khalil. She did not speak about it. She did not brief it. She did not put it on the main intelligence display board. She kept it on her personal whiteboard, the one she had positioned in her corner of the operations room, at an angle that made it visible only from her workstation. And night after night, raid after raid, the picture grew. Khalil was not a ghost. He was something more sophisticated than a ghost. A ghost leaves no trace. Khalil left traces everywhere, but he left them in a pattern that was designed to look like noise. A phone number used once and discarded. A name spelled 3 different ways across 4 different documents. A physical description that varied just enough between detainee accounts to suggest multiple individuals rather than one. He was not hiding, he was refracting, splitting his identity across the data the way light splits through a prism so that anyone looking at any single fragment would see something incomplete and move on. But Megan did not look at single fragments. She looked at the spaces between them, the absences, the silences. The same methodology that had identified the East African logistics node 18 months earlier. And what the silences told her was that Khalil was not a mailman as Drummond had dismissed him. Khalil was the postal system. He was the infrastructure through which the mail moved. Without him, the cells could not coordinate. Without him, the bomb makers could not receive materials. Without him, the leadership that Drummond was so eager to hunt would be issuing orders into a void. Remove Khalil and the network would not just be damaged, it would lose the ability to function as a network. It would become a collection of isolated cells, deaf and blind to each other, unable to coordinate the complex multi-vehicle attacks that were killing hundreds of Baghdad civilians every month. She knew this. She could see it on the whiteboard. But knowing it and proving it to a 3-star general who had already told her no were two different operations, and the second one required something, the first did not. It required patience. The raids continued. Shadow Cell was running at a tempo that the American military had never seen a unit of 60 operators sustain. Multiple compounds per night, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. The intelligence cycle had compressed from what had previously been days or weeks into hours. A phone intercepted at midnight would be cross-referenced against human intelligence from a previous operations detainee by 2 a.m. A grid reference confirmed by aerial surveillance by 2:30. A pattern of life assessed. An assault window identified. By 4 a.m., boots were on target. The men who conducted these operations moved through Baghdad in sandals and civilian clothing, in unmarked vehicles that looked like every other battered sedan on every other Baghdad street. They did not look like soldiers because looking like soldiers was a tactical failure. The insurgency had learned to read coalition patterns the way ranchers read weather. A convoy of armored vehicles moving through a neighborhood at midnight announced itself to every intelligence asset within a 3-kilometer radius 45 minutes before it arrived. By the time conventional forces were through the door, the rooms were empty. Shadow Cell did not announce. Shadow Cell arrived, and Nolan Pruitt was the first man through every door. He had been doing this for 4 rotations now, and something had changed in him that he could not have articulated even if someone had asked, which no one did. The first rotation he had felt fear before every entry. Normal fear. The kind that sharpens the senses and accelerates the heart rate and keeps a man alive. The second rotation, the fear had become routine. Still present, but no longer remarkable. Like the sound of generators at a forward operating base. Always there. Easy to ignore. By the 4th rotation, the fear had been replaced by something else. Not courage. Courage implies a choice. This was more like gravity, an ambient, directionless force that pulled him toward the door the way the earth pulls objects toward its surface. Not because he wanted to go through the door, not because he was brave, because he had been going through doors for so long that going through doors was simply what his body did at 2 in the morning when someone told him there was a door that needed going through. But the targets had changed. The targets had become sharper. More precise, more productive. And Pruitt, who was not an analyst and did not pretend to understand the intelligence architecture that selected his targets, had noticed. He had noticed because the rooms were no longer empty. Before Megan, 1 in 3 raids produced a high-value detention. After Megan, the ratio inverted. 3 in 4 raids produced actionable results. The operators were spending less time kicking in doors that led to nothing, and more time kicking in doors that led to the men they were looking for. The intelligence materials seized were richer. The detainee interviews more productive. The network map on the main display board was filling in faster than it ever had, and Pruitt knew why. He knew it was the woman in the corner. The one he had told Hale he did not want. The one he had assessed as a liability. The one who sat at her workstation every night while his team went out, and who was still sitting there when they came back surrounded by documents and screens, and that whiteboard covered in lines that he could not read, but that he had come to understand were the reason his men were coming home. He did not apologize to her. Pruitt was not a man who apologized because apology implied that the original assessment had been made in bad faith, and it had not. He had made a tactical judgment based on available information. The information had changed. He adjusted. What he did was simpler and more meaningful than an apology. On the 4th night of the 3rd week, he walked past her workstation on his way to the pre-assault briefing, and he stopped. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at her. The house in Dora tonight. The one with the secondary target on the second floor. You are certain he uses the back staircase after midnight? She looked up. She was certain. Because his phone connects to the cell tower on the southeast side of the building between 12:15 and 12:40 every night. That is consistent with the back staircase, not the front. Front staircase faces northwest. The signal would route through a different tower. Prewitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that Megan would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was praise. It was not praise. It was something more valuable than praise from a man like Nolan Pruitt. She does not need to kick the door. She tells us which door to kick. He said it to no one. He said it to the room. He said it to himself. And then he walked into the briefing and adjusted the assault plan based on her analysis of a cell tower signal. That night, the team entered through the back of the house. The secondary target was on the back staircase between 12:15 and 12:40, exactly where the phone signal said he would be. He was detained without a shot fired. The material seized from his person included a SIM card that contained, when decrypted by signals intelligence specialists the following morning, a partial directory of al-Qaeda logistics coordinators operating across 3 Baghdad districts. Megan added the data to both streams, the official map for Drummond and the private map of Khalil. 7 weeks after her arrival, the Khalil file contained 412 cross-referenced data points drawn from 29 separate operations. She had identified his approximate operating area. She had identified 3 locations he had used as meeting points. She had identified the pattern of his communication cycles, the way he activated and deactivated phone numbers on a rotating schedule that followed a logic she had decoded by the 5th week. She had not found him, but she had found the shape of him, the negative space he occupied in the network. And the shape told her something that she had suspected from the beginning, but could not prove until now. Khalil was not a mid-level facilitator. Khalil was the single point of failure for the entire al-Qaeda network in Baghdad. She was ready to brief it, but not to Drummond. Not yet. She needed one more piece, one more operation, one more fragment of evidence that would make the case so overwhelming that dismissal would be impossible. That operation was Ridgeline. The target was a farmhouse on the outskirts of the Yusufiyah district, south of Baghdad, in the area that coalition forces called the Triangle of Death. The official target package identified it as a mid-level media and logistics cell. The official intelligence assessment prepared by Megan for the tasked mission supported that classification, but on her private whiteboard, the farmhouse was something else. 3 separate data threads converged on that location. A phone number associated with Khalil's communication network had been active within 500 meters of the farmhouse on 2 occasions in the previous month. A detainee from a raid in Dora had mentioned a meeting location south of Baghdad that matched the grid reference, and the aerial surveillance imagery showed a pattern of vehicle movement around the farmhouse that was consistent with a logistics hub, not a media cell. If Khalil was going to be anywhere that Shadow Cell could reach, he was going to be at that farmhouse. Megan did not share this assessment with anyone except Prewitt. She told him the night before the operation, standing at her whiteboard in the empty operations room at 3 in the morning, while the rest of the compound slept. This is not just a media cell. This location is connected to the network I have been tracking. If the materials inside that building are what I think they are, I can map the entire architecture. Every cell, every supply line, every connection. Prewitt looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the lines. He did not understand all of them, but he understood the woman who had drawn them. He understood that she had been right about every target she had identified for 7 weeks. He understood that her analytical methodology had transformed Shadow Cell's operational effectiveness in ways that the official reporting chain had not yet fully recognized. What do you need from me? Everything that comes out of that building, every document, every hard drive, every phone, every scrap of paper, even the things that look like nothing, especially the things that look like nothing. He nodded. Then he said something that surprised her. You should know that the preliminary assessment says this one might be hot. Armed resistance. Possible suicide assets. She held his gaze. I know. I wrote the preliminary assessment. Operation Ridgeline launched at 0100 on a Thursday night in April of 2006. Shadow Cell deployed in 4 vehicles. 16 operators. Prewitt leading the assault element. The farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt track flanked by palm groves isolated enough that the approach would be exposed for the final 300 meters. No cover, no concealment, just open ground between the vehicles and the door. They covered those 300 meters in Sandals. The contact was immediate. The first shots came from the roof. Automatic weapons fire that raked the ground in front of the lead element and sent two operators diving for cover behind a low concrete wall that bordered the farmhouse courtyard. Prewitt was through the front gate when a grenade came over the wall from inside the compound and detonated 4 meters to his left. The blast threw him sideways. Shrapnel hit his left shoulder and right thigh. He went down on one knee, stayed there for approximately 2 seconds, and then stood up and continued moving toward the door. Behind him, 2 more operators had been hit. One took a round through the upper arm. The other caught shrapnel from a second grenade that detonated near the courtyard entrance. Neither stopped moving. Then the suicide bomber appeared. He came from behind a parked vehicle on the east side of the compound. He was wearing a vest. He was running toward the cluster of operators at the front gate. In the dark at that distance, in the chaos of a firefight that had been underway for less than 90 seconds, identifying and engaging a single running figure required a specific kind of vision and a specific kind of calm. The sniper in the Overwatch helicopter fired twice. The bomber went down 11 meters from the gate. Prewitt hit the front door. The building was cleared room by room. In one room, they found women and children huddled against the far wall, silent in the way that people become silent when they have passed through fear into a state beyond it. In another room, they found weapons, AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, detonation cord, and in a third room, the one that Megan had predicted would be the intelligence center of the operation, they found what she had come for: hard drives, notebooks, SIM cards, a laptop with its screen still glowing, financial records, communication logs, a hand-drawn map of Baghdad with locations marked in red ink that corresponded to no known target set. Khalil was not in the building. The operators searched every room. They searched the outbuildings. They searched the Palm Grove. Khalil was not there. Whether he had left minutes before the assault or had never been there at all was unclear. The official after-action report classified Operation Ridgeline as a partial success. High-value target not detained. Secondary objectives achieved. Significant intelligence materials seized. Prewitt was medevaced to the field surgical unit with shrapnel wounds. He refused general anesthesia. He told the surgeon to do what needed to be done and do it fast, because he intended to be back at the fishbowl by morning. The surgeon looked at the wounds, looked at Prewitt, and began working. Back at the fishbowl, Megan received the seized materials at 0300. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She began the exploitation process that she had been preparing for since the first night she had written Khalil's name on her whiteboard. By 0417, she had decrypted the first layer of the laptop's file structure. By 0500, she had cross-referenced the phone numbers on the seized SIM cards against her existing Khalil database. By 0630, she had translated enough of the handwritten notebooks to understand what she was looking at. And at 0712, sitting alone in the operations room, with the gray light of a Baghdad morning coming through the blast film windows, she stopped. She had found it. Not Khalil. Something larger. The hand-drawn map with the red ink markings was not a map of targets. It was a map of the network itself. It was Khalil's personal operational chart, the document he used to manage the flow of materials and personnel between cells. And in the upper right corner of that map, written in a different hand in ink that was fresher than the rest, was a notation that included a 6-digit grid reference and a name: Al-Naqib, the founder, the operational commander, the most wanted man in Iraq. Khalil's map did not just show where Al-Naqib had been. The grid reference, when plotted against current signals intelligence, corresponded to an area north of Bakuba where NSA intercepts had detected a cluster of communications activity that had been flagged but not yet resolved. Megan had done what Drummond had told her not to do. She had hunted the mailman, and the mailman had led her to the man at the top. She briefed Drummond at 0800. She did not present it as vindication. She did not remind him that he had dismissed Khalil as someone else's problem. She presented the data, the map, the grid reference, the correlation with signals intelligence, the chain of evidence that ran from Operation Ridgeline through the Khalil network to al-Naqib's probable location. Drummond looked at the map. He looked at the grid reference. He looked at the signals intelligence correlation. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Megan and said 6 words. "I was wrong about the mailman." From that morning forward, every target selection for shadow cell operations in the Baghdad area went through Megan Calloway's workstation. The private whiteboard was moved to the center of the operations room. The Khalil file was integrated into the official intelligence architecture, and the hunt for al-Naqib became the primary mission. But the hunt would take time. And time in Baghdad in the spring of 2006 was measured in bodies. The operational tempo that Shadow Cell maintained during this period was something that the American military establishment had not seen sustained by a unit of this size in the history of modern special operations. The original complement of 60 operators had been ground down by the cumulative weight of months of nightly combat rotations. 5 had been killed in action during operations across the Baghdad area. 14 had been wounded severely enough to require evacuation to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. 7 had completed their rotation cycle and returned to the United States. Their replacements delayed by the same bureaucratic pipeline that could deliver a satellite-guided munition to a grid reference within 6 minutes, but could not move a personnel transfer through Central Command in under 8 weeks. Another 17 were carrying injuries of varying severity that in any peacetime garrison would have resulted in immediate removal from operational duty. Pre-wit shrapnel wounds from ridgeline, stress fractures, soft tissue damage from repeated explosive concussions, the quiet accumulation of damage that the human body absorbs when it is asked to perform at maximum capacity in body armor night after night for months without pause. Of the original 60-17 were fully mission capable on any given night. 17 operators to cover a metropolitan area of 7 million people in which al-Qaeda maintained active cells in no fewer than 12 districts. 17 men and 1 woman with the whiteboard. 3 days after Ridgeline, Megan received a satellite phone call from Montana. It was Garrett. His voice sounded the way voices sound when the person speaking has rehearsed what they are going to say and is now discovering that rehearsal and performance are not the same thing. Their son, who was 4 years old and who had not seen his mother in 11 weeks, had asked a question at dinner. The question was simple in the way that only a child's questions are simple, which means it was not simple at all. Does mom kill people? Garrett had not known how to answer. He had said no, which was technically true and substantively a lie, because the targets that Megan identified were targets that ceased to exist. And the fact that she did not pull the trigger herself was a distinction that a 4-year-old would not understand, and that Megan herself had stopped finding meaningful weeks ago. After a silence that lasted long enough for the satellite connection to nearly drop, Garrett said something else. "I need to know when you are coming home. Not a promise, just a date. Just something I can put on the calendar so that he can count the days. So that I can count the days." She did not have a date. She could not give him a date. The operation was accelerating. The Khalil network was being dismantled node by node, raid by raid, and each node that fell revealed 2 more that needed to fall. And behind all of them was al-Naqib still out there, still issuing orders, still alive. She told Garrett she loved him. She told him she would call again in 3 days. She hung up the satellite phone and sat in the operations room for several minutes, looking at nothing. Then she went back to the whiteboard. 4 days later, Drummond called her into his office. The door was closed, which was unusual. Drummond operated with an open door as a matter of command philosophy. A closed door meant something had changed. The grid reference you provided from the Ridgeline materials. NSA has confirmed sustained communications activity consistent with a high-value command node. CENTCOM has authorized a strike package. 2 F-16s, 500-pound guided munitions. The strike window opens in 72 hours. Megan understood what he was telling her. She also understood what he was not telling her. If they bomb the site, we get a body. Maybe. If the bombs are accurate and the identification is possible. She paused. If we raid the site, we get everything. His files, his communications, His network contacts, the intelligence value of a living al-Naqib, or even a dead al-Naqib with intact materials, is orders of magnitude greater than a crater. Drummond looked at her. His face showed nothing. Generals learn to keep their faces empty the way poker players do, and for the same reason. I am aware of the intelligence calculus, Captain. I am also aware that Shadow Cell has 17 operational personnel available for deployment. Prewitt is carrying shrapnel wounds that should have him in Landstuhl. 3 operators are pending medical evaluation. The team is running at 60% strength and has been conducting multiple operations per night for 11 consecutive weeks. He leaned forward. I am asking you a direct question. Can your intelligence support a ground operation against this target within 72 hours? Not can it theoretically support one. Can it support one that I can authorize with confidence that I am not sending 17 exhausted men into a situation that we do not adequately understand? Megan looked at the general. She thought about the whiteboard. She thought about the 412 data points. She thought about Prewitt, who was at that moment in the medical bay having his shoulder rebandaged, and who would be in the operations room by nightfall, because that was what Prewitt did. She thought about Garrett counting days on a calendar that had no circle on it. Give me 12 more hours to confirm the pattern of life at the target location. If the signal's intelligence holds, I can give you a ground assault package with a confidence level that meets your threshold. Drummond studied her for a long moment. 12 hours. Not 13. The strike window does not move. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. General, my team will be ready. The question is whether you want a crater or a library. She did not wait for an answer. She opened the door and walked back to her whiteboard and began the 12 hours of work that would determine whether al-Naqib died in an explosion that destroyed everything he knew, or whether Shadow Cell would go through one more door in Sandals in the dark and bring back the architecture of the entire network. The 12 hours passed the way all decisive hours pass, not in a rush, in a crawl. Megan Calloway sat at her workstation and dismantled the problem the way her father had taught her to read terrain, not from the trail, from the ridgeline, from above, from the place where the whole picture becomes visible and the details arrange themselves into a logic that was always there, but that only patience and elevation can reveal. The target location was a farmhouse compound in a rural area north of Bakuba in Diyala province. The signals intelligence showed 3 distinct communication devices active within the compound over the previous 9 days. One was a satellite phone that transmitted in short bursts at irregular intervals. One was a local mobile number that contacted a small network of numbers already flagged in the Khalil database. The third was a device that appeared to function as a relay receiving calls from one network and forwarding them to another, never originating communication, only passing it through. That third device was the signature. Al-Naqib did not communicate. He relayed. He sat at the center of the web and allowed information to flow through him without ever putting his own voice on a line that could be intercepted and attributed. It was exactly the communication architecture that Megan would have designed if she had been building a terrorist network from scratch and wanted to make the command node invisible. It was also, she realized at the 4-hour mark, exactly the communication architecture that made a ground raid exponentially more valuable than an airstrike, because the relay device would contain routing data, call histories, network identifiers, the digital blueprint of every cell that al-Naqib commanded. A 500-pound bomb would turn that device into fragments of silicon and copper, scattered across a crater. A ground team could put that device in a bag and have it on her desk within hours. She built the target package methodically. Compound layout from aerial surveillance, pattern of life from 9 days of signals monitoring, entry and exit routes, civilian presence assessment. She flagged 2 structures within the compound that showed heat signatures consistent with occupied rooms, and 1 structure that showed a heat signature consistent with electronic equipment, a generator, and possibly computing hardware. She identified the assault window. Between 0100 and 0300, the communication pattern dropped to near 0. The occupants were sleeping or at minimum not conducting active operations. The approach route from the nearest coalition staging area was 14 kilometers over rural roads that were not regularly patrolled by either coalition or insurgent forces. Travel time approximately 22 minutes in unmarked vehicles at speeds consistent with local traffic patterns. At the 11-hour mark, she completed the target package. At the 11-hour and 20-minute mark, she presented it to Colonel Hale. At the 11-hour and 40-minute mark, Hale walked it into Drummond's office. At the 12-hour mark exactly, Drummond authorized the ground operation. The strike package was stood down. The F-16S returned to their holding pattern. Shadow Cell would go through the door. Megan had done something she had never done before in preparing the package. She had included herself in the operational manifest. Not as an operator, not as a combatant, as an on-site intelligence exploitation specialist. She had argued to Hale, and Hale had argued to Drummond that the value of having the primary analyst physically present at the target site during the initial exploitation of seized materials was significant enough to justify the risk. That decisions about which materials to prioritize, which devices to extract, which documents to photograph in situ, rather than remove, required the kind of real-time analytical judgment that could not be conducted remotely over a radio link. Drummond had approved it. Prewitt had not objected. That second fact surprised her more than the first. At 2200 hours, 7 hours before the assault window opened, Megan walked into the medical bay where Prewitt was sitting on an examination table while a medic redressed the wounds from Ridgeline. His left shoulder was a landscape of purple and yellow bruising around a sutured laceration that should have kept him off operational duty for a minimum of 3 weeks. His right thigh had a compression bandage over a shrapnel wound that the surgeon had described as superficial in the way that surgeons describe things that would put a civilian in a hospital bed for a month. Prewitt looked up when she walked in. He did not look surprised to see her. "You are coming with us." It was not a question. "I am coming with you." He studied her face. The medic continued working on his shoulder, as though the conversation was not happening. "Have you ever been outside the wire in a non-permissive environment?" "No." "Have you ever worn body armor for more than a fitting?" "Number." "Have you ever heard a gunshot that was not on a training range?" She held his gaze. "No." He was quiet for a moment. The medic finished the dressing and stepped back. Prewitt rolled his shoulder once, testing the range of motion, and winced in a way that he clearly did not intend to be visible. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say when I say it with no delay and no questions. If I tell you to get down, you are already on the ground before the last word leaves my mouth. If I tell you to run, you run. You do not stop to collect materials. You do not stop to photograph documents. You run." "Understood." "Understood." He looked at her for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression. It was not warmth. Prewitt did not do warmth. It was something closer to recognition. The acknowledgement of a person who has earned the right to be in the room. "Your target packages have kept my men alive for 11 weeks. Every door you pointed us at had someone behind it. Every assessment you made was accurate. I have been doing this for 15 years, and I have never worked with an intelligence officer who sees what you see." He paused. "So, when we get inside that compound, you do what you came to do. Find what you need to find. I will make sure you have the time to find it. That is my job. Your job is the reason we are going through that door, instead of watching it disappear from a drone feed." She nodded. She did not trust her voice to say anything that would not diminish what he had just said. At 0030, Shadow Cell departed the fishbowl. 3 vehicles, 17 operators, 1 intelligence officer, sandals, civilian clothing, weapons concealed beneath loose outer garments. Megan rode in the second vehicle, seated between Prewitt and a young operator named Foley, whose age she estimated at 23, and whose face showed the specific emptiness that she had come to recognize as the operational mask, the expression that combat soldiers wear when they are conserving every ounce of psychological energy for the moment when the door comes down and the world compresses to a hallway and a weapon, and the space between one heartbeat and the next. No one spoke during the drive. The streets of Baghdad at night were orange-lit and empty in the way that streets become empty in cities where being outside after dark is a survival calculation rather than a lifestyle choice. They passed through 2 checkpoints manned by Iraqi police, who waved the unmarked vehicles through without inspection. They crossed the Diyala Bridge and turned north onto a rural road that narrowed from paved to gravel to dirt over the course of 6 kilometers. At 0112, they reached the staging point, a date palm grove, 300 meters south of the target compound. The vehicles stopped. The engines cut. Silence. Prewitt dismounted first. The operators followed in a sequence so practiced that it appeared choreographed, each man moving to a position that he already knew, each weapon oriented toward a sector that had been assigned during the briefing 4 hours earlier. Megan dismounted last. Her body armor felt heavier than it had during the fitting. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Inside her chest, something was hammering at a rate that she knew was unsustainable, but that she could not slow down. They covered the 300 meters to the compound on foot, in sandals, in the dark. The only sound was the rustle of palm fronds in a wind that came from the east and carried the smell of irrigation water and diesel and earth. The compound wall was 3 meters high. Concrete, 1 gate facing south. Prewitt positioned the entry team at the gate. He positioned the overwatch element at the northeast corner with a line of sight to the compound interior. He positioned Megan against the exterior wall 6 meters from the gate with Foley beside her. "Stay here until I call you in." She nodded. Prewitt looked at his team. He did not give a speech. He did not give a signal that Megan could identify. He simply began to move toward the gate, and the team moved with him, and the gate opened, and they went through it. What happened next lasted approximately 4 minutes. Megan heard the breach. She heard the controlled shouts that operators use to dominate a space. Short, sharp commanding. She heard footsteps rapid and purposeful moving through rooms. She heard 2 shots suppress the sound more like a book being dropped on a hardwood floor than anything Hollywood had taught her to expect. Then silence. Then Prewitt's voice on the radio, 1 word, "Clear." Then a second word, "Callaway." She moved through the gate with Foley beside her. The compound interior was dark, except for the beams of weapon-mounted lights sweeping through doorways. She could see operators in each room standing over seated or prone figures whose hands were already zip-tied behind their backs. She counted 7 individuals detained. None of them were resisting. Prewitt met her at the entrance to the main building. His face was unreadable. "You need to see this." He led her through a hallway and into a room at the back of the building. The room had been used as a living space. A sleeping mat on the floor, a small table, a kerosene lamp. On the table was a plate of food, half-eaten. Beside the plate was a glass of tea still warm. On the floor face down was a man. He was not zip-tied. He was not detained. He was dead. The blood beneath him had not yet fully settled into the concrete. It was fresh, hours old at most. But the wound was not from a coalition weapon. The wound was from a knife. A single deep laceration across the throat made from behind, made by someone who was standing close enough to embrace the man they were killing. Prewitt pointed at the dead man's right hand. On the wrist was a watch. An expensive watch. The kind of watch that a man at the top of a network wears because he has the money to wear it, and the arrogance to believe that no one will ever be close enough to notice. Megan looked at the watch. She looked at the wound. She looked at the room. One of his own people did this. Prewitt nodded. Megan stood very still. The analytical part of her brain, the part that had been running continuously for 11 weeks, was assembling the picture. Shadow Cell's operational tempo. The relentless nightly raids, the systematic dismantling of the network. Node by node, cell by cell. The pace so fast that the insurgency could not adapt, could not regroup, could not determine where the leaks were coming from. The paranoia that kind of pressure generates inside a clandestine organization. The suspicion, the accusations, the internal investigations that become indistinguishable from purges. Al-Naqib had not been killed by Shadow Cell. Al-Naqib had been killed by the fear of Shadow Cell. The sustained, methodical, unrelenting pressure that Megan had designed and directed from her whiteboard in the fishbowl had not just degraded the network, it had poisoned it. It had turned the network against itself. The cells that could no longer communicate through Khalil's disrupted channels had begun to suspect each other. The operatives who disappeared night after night, taken in raids that seemed to anticipate their every movement, had created a climate of suspicion so toxic that the network's own immune system had attacked its own heart. Prewitt was watching her face. He had seen a lot of faces in a lot of rooms over 15 years. He had seen fear and rage and grief and the blank nothing that sometimes follows violence. He had not often seen what he saw on Megan Calloway's face in that moment. Understanding. Complete and total understanding. The understanding of a woman who had set something in motion and was now standing in the room where that motion had reached its conclusion. "You killed him without being in the room," he said. His voice was quiet, not admiring, not accusing, factual. She did not respond. She was already moving to the table where the dead man's materials were laid out. A notebook, 2 mobile phones, a USB drive, a hand-drawn map that she recognized immediately as a variant of the map she had been reconstructing for 11 weeks on her whiteboard. She worked for 40 minutes while the operators maintained the security perimeter. She photographed every document. She cataloged every device. She took the notebook and the USB drive and the phones and placed them in evidence bags with the careful precision of a surgeon handling tissue samples. When she was finished, she stood up and walked out of the room and out of the compound and into the night air. She pulled the body armor away from her chest because it felt like it was compressing her lungs. She leaned against the exterior wall and breathed. Prewitt found her there 2 minutes later. "Time to go." She nodded. They walked back to the vehicles. They drove back to Baghdad. The sun was coming up when they reached the fishbowl. The sky was the color of rust and ash. The call to prayer was sounding from a mosque somewhere in the green zone, the amplified voice carrying across the rooftops and into the windows of the operations room, where Megan sat down at her workstation and opened the notebook she had taken from beside a dead man's half-eaten dinner. The data from the Bakuba compound confirmed what the Ridgeline materials had begun to reveal. Al-Naqib's personal records contained the operational blueprint of the entire al-Qaeda network in Baghdad. Cell structures, supply lines, financial channels, personnel rosters, communication protocols, safe house locations. The architecture that Megan had spent 11 weeks reconstructing from fragments and silences was laid out in the dead man's own handwriting, complete, intact, legible. Over the following weeks, Shadow Cell used that blueprint to systematically dismantle what remained of the network. The operations continued at the same tempo. Multiple raids per night, intelligence exploited within hours. Each operation feeding the next. But now they were not reconstructing the map as they went. They had the map. They were simply crossing off names. By March of 2008, the data told a story that no classified briefing had been willing to predict 2 years earlier. The Sunni insurgency in Baghdad had collapsed. Not retreated, not regrouped, collapsed. The organizational architecture had been dismantled at a structural level. 3,500 individuals removed from the battlefield, 150 bombings per month reduced to 2. 60 operators, 18 months of peak operational tempo within a 26-month deployment. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Bryce wrote a second memo. This one was not classified. It was a personal assessment included in a research file that was later accessed by defense journalists working on accounts of the period. "We thought we understood special operations. We thought we were the benchmark. What Shadow Cell showed us over those 18 months is that we had been measuring the wrong things, and we had misjudged who belongs on a battlefield." When Major General Drummond spoke to reporters in August of 2008, his public statement was measured and diplomatic in the way that generals' public statements are always measured and diplomatic. Shadow Cell has contributed immensely to operations in the Baghdad area, in particular to the dismantling of vehicle-borne explosive device networks and other insurgent operations in the capital city. The private assessment, the one that filtered through to researchers and journalists over the years that followed, was less measured. Officers who had watched Shadow Cell operate described the unit not as partners, not as allies in the conventional sense, but as something they had no existing reference point for. Something that fell outside the categories their training had provided. And at the center of that, something the officers consistently identified the intelligence architecture built by a single captain who had arrived in Baghdad with no combat experience and had proceeded to see what no one else in the theater could see. The cost was not abstract. 5 shadow cell operators were killed during the 18-month period of peak operations. 22 were wounded. In a unit of 60 deployable personnel, those were not statistics on a briefing slide. Those were empty chairs in the operations room, empty bunks in the sleeping quarters, names that the men who remained said aloud in private and carried in silence in public. Prewitt was medically retired 4 months after the Bakuba operation. The accumulated shrapnel wounds, the shoulder from ridgeline, the thigh, the smaller fragments in his back and his left forearm from 3 separate engagements that he had not reported at the time, because reporting them would have meant leaving the line, had finally produced a medical assessment that even he could not argue with. He went home to a house in North Carolina where his wife had been waiting through 4 deployments. He sat on the porch of that house in the evenings and watched the tree line and did not speak about what had happened in Baghdad. Not because it was classified, though it was. Because the language for it did not exist in the vocabulary available to a man sitting on a porch in North Carolina, watching the light change through pine trees. The man next to me had not stopped, so I did not stop. And the man next to me did not stop because the man next to him had not stopped. That is how it works. That is the only way it works. He said that once to a journalist who had tracked him down through a mutual acquaintance. Then he asked the journalist to leave. Colonel Hale retired from the Army the following year. He never spoke publicly about Shadow Cell. Drummond went on to command larger formations and to receive the kind of recognition that generals receive when operations they authorized produce results that can be presented to congressional committees. He mentioned Megan Calloway by name exactly once in a private conversation with a fellow general officer that was later recounted in a published account. She saw the network the way an architect sees a building, from the inside. She understood its logic, its pressure points, its specific vulnerabilities, and then she took it apart. Bryce transferred to an intelligence liaison role where he spent the next 3 years implementing network analysis methodologies based on the framework that Megan had developed. He never wrote another memo recommending the reassignment of an intelligence officer based on gender or combat status. Megan Calloway left Baghdad on a military transport in the spring of 2008. She had been in theater for 26 months. She had not intended to stay that long. No one intends to stay that long, but the operation had a momentum of its own, and she had been the engine of that momentum, and engines do not stop because the person inside them is tired. She flew to Ramstein, then to Dover, then a connecting flight to Missoula, Montana, where Garrett was waiting at the arrivals gate with their son, who was now 6 and who had grown 4 inches since the last time she had held him. The boy ran to her. He wrapped his arms around her legs and pressed his face into her and said nothing. Children know things about homecomings that adults have learned to conceal. They know that the person who comes back is not always the same person who left. They hold on tighter because of it. Garrett stood at the gate and watched her pick up their son and hold him against her chest. He did not rush forward. He waited. When she reached him, he looked at her face and he saw what was there and what was no longer there and what had been added in its place. He did not ask about Baghdad. He did not ask about the operations or the Sandals or the 3,500 names that had been crossed off a whiteboard in a requisitioned mansion on the other side of the world. He looked down at her feet. She was still wearing sandals, not military sandals, not tactical footwear modified for low visibility operations. Simple leather sandals worn and cracked and shaped to her feet by 26 months of Baghdad heat and operations room floors, and the 300 meters of dark ground between a date palm grove and a compound wall in Diyala province. Garrett looked at the sandals and then looked at her face and did not ask. They drove to the house in the Bitterroot Valley, the house where she had grown up, the house her mother had left to her when she moved to Billings. The house where her father had died on the sofa on a Saturday in October 10 years earlier. The house had not changed. The valley had not changed. The mountains on either side still rose into weather that moved faster than a person could prepare for it. The meadows still turned gold in September. The Bitterroot River still ran south to north through the cottonwoods. She walked inside. She put her son down. He ran to his room to get a drawing. He had made a drawing of a house with 3 people in front of it and a son in the corner, and the word home written across the top in letters that leaned in different directions. Megan stood in the living room. The sofa was still there. The same sofa. She had never replaced it. Her mother had offered to have it hauled away years ago, and Megan had said no without being able to explain why. Now she understood why. She had kept it for the same reason she had enlisted, because the question had not been answered yet. She sat down on the sofa. She sat in the exact spot where her father had been sitting when his heart stopped. She felt the cushion give under her weight, the way it had given under his. She smelled the fabric which after 10 years smelled only of dust and the particular stillness of rooms that had been empty too long. She understood now. She understood what had killed him. Not the war, not the alcohol, not the VA's failure to ask the right questions. What killed Emmett Calloway was the distance between the person he had been in the desert and the person the sofa required him to be. The desert had given him clarity, purpose, a reason to read the terrain and find the pattern and make the decision and live or die by the outcome. The sofa asked him to be still. The sofa asked him to stop reading the terrain. And for a man who had been built to read terrain, who had taught his 8-year-old daughter to read terrain because it was the truest thing he knew how to share, being asked to stop was not rest. It was erasure. Megan sat on the sofa and felt the weight of 26 months pressing down on her, the way a Bergen rucksack presses down on a man climbing a mountain in the dark. She felt the faces of the 5 operators who did not come home. She felt the half-eaten dinner beside a dead man in Bakuba. She felt the 4-year-old voice on a satellite phone asking, "Does mom kill people?" She felt the 11 weeks of whiteboards and silences and data points that connected human beings to their disappearance. And she felt the question. The same question her father had faced. The same question that every person who has operated at the edge of human capability and then been asked to return to the center must face. Does the thing that made you effective in the war follow you home? Does it sit with you on the sofa? Does it watch you from the corner of the room while your son shows you a drawing of a house with 3 people and a son? And if it does, what do you do with it? Do you let it consume you the way it consumed your father? Do you drown it? Do you ignore it until it stops your heart? Or do you do something that Emmett Calloway never had the chance to do because no one had taught him how, and no one had asked him if he needed to learn? Do you put it down? Megan looked down at her feet. The sandals, cracked leather, Baghdad dust still in the seams. She had worn them on every operation. She had worn them in the fishbowl. She had worn them on the flight home. She had worn them through the airport in Missoula, where Garrett had looked at them and said nothing. She had not taken them off in 26 months. Not because they were comfortable, not because she had no other shoes, because they were the last piece of the operational posture, the last artifact of the person she had become in Baghdad, the person who could look at a whiteboard and see a network, who could point at a door and know what was behind it, who could sit in a room with a dead man and feel not horror but understanding. That person had saved lives. That person had removed 3,500 terrorists from a battlefield. That person had done what $60 billion of military technology could not do. And that person lived in the Sandals. Her son came running back into the room with his drawing. He climbed onto the sofa beside her. He put the drawing in her lap and pointed at the 3 figures in front of the house. "That is you. That is Dad. That is me. We are home." Megan looked at the drawing. She looked at her son. She looked at Garrett, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, watching her with the patience of a man who has spent 26 months practicing the art of waiting and who understands that the most important things cannot be rushed. She reached down. She unbuckled the left sandal, then the right. She placed them on the floor beside the sofa, side by side. The way you place something that you are not throwing away, but that you are choosing for the first time to set down. Her feet touched the wooden floor, bare, cool, the wood grain smooth under her skin. For the first time in 26 months, Megan Calloway was not wearing sandals. For the first time in 10 years, she was sitting on her father's sofa, and the question had an answer. The war does follow you home. It does sit with you. It does watch from the corner. But it does not have to be the thing that kills you. Not if you decide. Not if you make the decision the way you made every other decision. Not in a moment of drama. Not in a moment of collapse. In a quiet room with your son beside you and your husband watching from the doorway and a drawing of a house in your lap. You put the sandals on the floor, you feel the wood under your feet, and you begin the work of learning to be still. Outside, the Bitterroot Valley stretched toward mountains that did not care about wars or networks or the men and women who fought them. The river ran south to north through the cottonwoods. The light was changing the way Montana light changes in the late afternoon gold to amber, to something that has no name but that anyone who has seen it remembers. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in a secure facility at Fort Bragg, there is a memo. Written at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in the spring of 2006. It says that a shadow element was assessed as under strength, that their footwear was non-standard, that their readiness was uncertain, that their intelligence officer was non-combat female and should be reassigned. Every word of that memo was wrong, not wrong by the standards of the man who wrote it. Wrong by the standards of what actually happened. Wrong by the standards of what 60 people in Sandals did to a network that the most powerful military in human history had failed to break. Wrong by the standards of a woman who arrived in Baghdad with no combat experience and left it 26 months later, having dismantled the most dangerous terrorist organization in the world by understanding something that satellites and drones and 500-pound bombs cannot understand. The pattern. The silence. The space between the data points where the truth lives. Those lunatics wore sandals. Yes, they did. And one of them was a woman from Montana who learned to read terrain from a father who could not survive the peace, who saw networks the way architects see buildings, who told 60 of the most dangerous men on earth which doors to walk through, and who came home and sat on a sofa and took off her shoes and chose in the quiet of a valley that had not changed to answer the question that her father never could. She chose to live.